I'll take a shot in the dark here, but I bet it's safe to assume you've all had coffee before. You'd probably recognize a roasted coffee bean, or a ground roasted coffee bean for that matter. You know what it smells like. You know what it tastes like. You very likely have an addiction to one of the chemicals found in coffee, and that's okay. No judgment here. I drink it too. In fact, let me show you how I get my coffee fix. Let's start with the bean. I'm using an organic, fair trade, shade-grown, Ethiopian, medium dark roast, medium bodied, sweet floral aroma, 100% Arabica, whole bean coffee. So that's a long list of descriptors. What do they all mean? Organic just means that this is produced without the use of chemical fertilizers, pesticides, or other artificial agents. Fair trade is an arrangement designed to help producers in growing countries achieve sustainable and equitable trade relationships with wealthy countries, consumers. At least that's the claim. It really still unequally benefits the capitalists and is just an attempt to not make them look like such obvious villains. Shade grown. So the historical, natural way coffee grows is under the shade of a tree canopy. But as a result of modernization and a push for higher yielding crops, sun-tolerant coffee plants were created to produce larger yields through higher density open planting. But the cultivation practices used for them are considered unsustainable by some. So we're going with an old school growing method here. Ethiopian coffee. Ethiopia is where coffee Arabica, the coffee plant, originated. So we'll be paying homage to the history of coffee with this brew. Medium dark roast. So there's a few genres of roasted coffee. The light roast, light brown in color, generally preferred for milder coffee varieties. There will be no oil on the surface of these beans because they are not roasted long enough for the oils to break through the surface. Medium roast. This roast is medium brown in color with a stronger flavor and again a non-oily surface. It's often referred to as the American roast because it is generally preferred in the United States. Let me know if that's your preference in the comments. Medium dark roast. That's the one. Rich, dark color with some oil on the surface and with a slight bittersweet aftertaste. Dark roast. Produces shiny black beans with an oily surface and a pronounced bitterness. The darker the roast, the less acidity will be found in the coffee beverage. Dark roast coffees run from slightly dark to charred. Medium-bodied sweet floral aroma. Yep. 100% Arabica. We touched on this already, but Arabica coffee is the first species to have been cultivated and today makes up 60% of the global market. Ironically, it's now endangered in the wild due to deforestation. So that's the magic bean. Let's talk about water. Wait, water again on this channel? It's pretty important. When we brew coffee, very much like tea, it's essentially a flavored water with a very compelling side effect. But if you start with a poor tasting water, it will negatively affect your coffee. Like any drug I put in my body, I want my coffee experience to be enjoyable. You don't have to climb the Alps and bottle it from a snowmelt stream, but I'll be using spring water rather than tap today. Don't brew with hard water. Don't brew with unfiltered water. You'll thank me later. If you decide to use tap water anyway, run the faucet cold, because running it hot will pick up more sediment from the pipes and hot water heater on the way to the faucet. Grind your coffee. Freshly ground coffee will always taste better than coffee ground some amount of time in the past. There is a myth that coffee for use in a French press should be ground more coarsely. No, a medium fine grind will work best here. I'm using a pretty big French press, so I'll be adding 40 grams of ground coffee and 750 grams of water. Get a kitchen scale already. If you want accurate, replicable measurements, measuring by weight is the way to go. Weigh your water cold, of course. It's okay if some of it evaporates in the heating process. Next, bring your water to a boil, then pour over your coffee grounds, and like tea, let it steep. It'll be a test of patience and self-control, but try to wait 10 minutes before pouring. If you pour it into a cup right away, it'll be too hot to drink anyway, and the longer you wait, the better it's going to taste. In the meantime, I don't know, read the news, watch the news, check the mail, check your socials, start a union, overthrow the ownership class, and by then, your coffee will be perfect. I like to pollute my coffee with cream and sugar. Sugar is simple, just add to taste. When it comes to cream, there are a ton of options. The best option, in my opinion, is full-on heavy cream. It really makes for a nice, velvety sort of texture. If dairy is not for you, then soy milk might be a good alternative, although I'm not sure that it achieves the same thickness. Coffee is done. That's a cup of coffee I can see myself leaving my own house and paying someone else like $7 for. Now, let's look beyond our own coffee use, or let's be honest, reliance, and analyze coffee's effect on greater society. To do this, of course, will require us to take a step back into the past. While there is some evidence that people have been drinking tea since the 2nd century BC, the invention of coffee is, in comparison, a relatively new phenomenon. As stated earlier, the coffee plant is an undergrowth plant requiring the shade of a tree canopy to thrive. Its climate requirements limit the plant's growth to the region of the world between the Tropic of Cancer and the Tropic of Capricorn, sometimes referred to as the coffee belt. Both historically and even to this day, the best coffee fruit are harvested by hand, and they often don't all ripen at the same time, which makes the process pretty labor-intensive. Oh, yeah, the coffee bean is not a bean at all. It's a seed that must be removed from the coffee fruit. According to legend, a 9th century goat herder in Ethiopia discovered the coffee plant after noticing his flock becoming stimulated after grazing on the plants. Of course, he didn't leave a first-hand record documenting his discovery and any possible experimentation with using the plant himself. This story wasn't recorded until a few centuries later, so we can take it with a grain of sugar. The earliest reliable accounts of coffee and trade came from Arabic scholars writing in the 15th century, noting its spread from Africa to Yemen. It was there that coffee seeds were first roasted and prepared in a similar way to how it's prepared now. By the 16th century, coffee had reached the rest of the Middle East, Persia, Turkey, and North Africa. coffee houses were popping up all over the Middle East and quickly became sources of entertainment and gathering places for intellectual discussion. While Europe had been drudging through its dark ages, the Arabic world was experiencing the golden age of Islam, which could very likely have something to do with the drugs the Muslim world were ingesting and not ingesting. The Europeans were drinking alcohol, while the Arabs were drinking coffee. A golden age, a renaissance, enlightenment, industrialization isn't formulated in a beer hall. In the early 17th century, the government of Yemen, where most coffee was grown at the time, tried to maintain a monopoly on its export. The word mocha, after all, is derived from the Red Sea Yemeni port of Mocha. In 1616, the Dutch East India Company was able to break the monopoly by smuggling coffee plants to their holdings in India and Indonesia. As the Dutch came to dominate the coffee trade, so much coffee was exported from the Dutch-Indonesian island of Java that Java became another generic word for coffee. The Dutch were also responsible for the introduction of coffee to the New World, where very quickly other European colonial powers, namely France and Portugal, smuggled plants to their own holdings in South America and began producing coffee themselves. It's at this point that the Portuguese set in motion the Brazilian coffee giant, which today dominates the world coffee market. Of course, any discussion of European colonialism and American cash crops includes the horrifying practices of slavery. More than 2 million enslaved people were imported from Africa between the 17th and middle of the 19th century to work the coffee plantations in Dutch Guiana and Brazil. By 1645, coffee had arrived in Italy, and the first European coffee house opened in Rome, then London in 1652, Paris by 1672, Austria and Poland in 1683, having been captured from the supplies of the Turks following the Austro-Polish victory at the Siege of Vienna. Lining up with the arrival of coffee into European trading centers was the European Age of Enlightenment, English Age of Reason, and the entrance of Europe into the modern world. Some notable coffee enthusiasts include Beethoven and Bach, Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin, de Balzac and Voltaire, Teddy Roosevelt and Napoleon Bonaparte. Coffee houses and coffee culture were generally more democratic than that of old world pubs. While the pub or tavern retained a hierarchy of class structure, you could sit anywhere in a coffee house with anyone, as long as you weren't a woman, and indulge in the new beverage that cleared the minds of those who otherwise were probably inebriated. While pubs were full of violent drunks, the coffee house became a place for leading thinkers to share ideas. Some coffee house discussions could become literally revolutionary. In fact, the mob that stormed the Bastille in Paris and instigated the French Revolution was whipped up in a coffee house, not a tavern. In the British 13 colonies, tea was the standard source of caffeine until the Boston Tea Party turned tea drinking unpatriotic, and coffee became the choice of American patriots. I think it's important to point out that the coffee that inspired writings like the Declaration of Independence, which held the self-evident truth that all men are created equal, and the Declaration of Rights of Man, written at the time of the French Revolution, that coffee that inspired the revolutionary men to write those documents was grown and harvested by enslaved people. Coffee was also instrumental in the rise of capitalism in the Western world. Prior to the introduction of coffee to the workplace and the Western world in general, people drank alcohol all hours of the day, because alcohol and fermentation would kill bacteria in the otherwise not potable water, They didn't yet understand that boiling water makes it even safer. The effects of constant alcohol consumption would have ranged from full-on drunkenness to being at least buzzed all of the time. This goes for children as well, drinking low-proof cider and beer. Many European laborers would have been allowed beer breaks. This both gave workers a calorie boost and probably made feudalism a little more bearable. With the shift from mostly agrarian societies to the introduction of widespread industrialization, a laborer with an alcohol buzz became less desirable. Being expected to operate dangerous factory machinery or being relied upon for accurate double-entry accounting was no longer the job of a drunk peasant, but rather a caffeinated working-class laborer. As oil, gas, and later electric lighting were introduced, business that had been constrained to daytime operation could now be conducted into the evening and even overnight. Workers, including children, were expected to work 12 to 16 hours per day, 6 days a week. I'd say impossible without coffee. I'd also say other things about that too. Luckily, labor unions were able to push for government oversight to rein back some of the power that these capitalist had over their employees. In modern times, the coffee break became an institution in America. Now it's standard to have 2 paid breaks and a psychoactive drug provided by your employer throughout an 8-hour workday. On the surface, this seems like a goodwill offering by the employer, but really it's just another way for the capitalists to extract more value from their laborers. The day-to-day use of an addictive drug comes with some negative consequences. The lethargy a coffee drinker experiences in the morning before their first cup is not natural. That is a symptom of withdrawal. That first cup is not so much about the pleasure it brings us, it's really about curbing the withdrawal that's begun setting in overnight. My intention here is not to convince you to quit drinking coffee, but instead to give coffee some more thought. Maybe not drink it so robotically. Think about the history, where it comes from, who grows it and harvests it, and why there's always a pot of Java in the office or on the work site. Cheers. One last thing, some exciting news. This show has its first Patreon supporter, so a big shout out to you, Denise Topol. For the rest of you, if you feel inclined to support the channel monetarily, there's a link to the Patreon in the description. And of course, like, share, subscribe, and we'll see you on the next one.